Well, hello, this is Vincent Green, and we're going to continue our study in the book of Genesis. We're in Genesis chapter 15, and we are in this latter part of the chapter, which really goes from verse 7 to verse 21. Let me read that section to you as we begin. Then the Lord told Abram, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land as your possession. But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it? The Lord told him, Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So Abram presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Some of the vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abram chased them away. As the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, You can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. Now, as for you, Abram, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. Now, after 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking firepot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day and said, I have given this land to your descendants all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. The land now occupied by the Kenites, Canaanites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. This chapter is about helping Abram be comforted in his fear, for him not to be afraid, really, for him to get rid of his worry and his anxiety and anything that would bring fear in his heart, because God anticipates it all and says, do not be afraid, Abram. That's how he addresses Abram in this passage, in this chapter. That's how it all begins. Abram is worried that is God's promise really going to happen? Is God's promise really going to take place? I just see this Eliezer. He's my servant. He's the one that's going to be my heir. He's the one that's going to be it, because I don't have a son. I have no progeny. But God tells him, no, your servant will not be your heir. You will have a son. You're going to have a son, and your son is going to have a son, and there's going to be descendants. If you could count the stars, that is how many of your descendants will be. And so Abram believes that, and the Lord counted that belief because of his faith. He counted that as righteousness, or counted him as righteous, as one whose heart is dedicated to serving the Lord, one whose heart is with the Lord. And so what God is doing is he's forcing an issue with Abram to make sure that Abram fully trusts in him, even though Abram doesn't know how things are going to work out. He just has to go on the promises that God has made. Those promises that are listed for us in chapter 12, reiterated in chapters 13 and 14. And here, once again, that God is going to give him many descendants. He's been reiterating that particular part of the promise primarily, and he's been showing him through the battle that took place in chapter 14 that God is raising him up, making him famous. And so this is to give Abram confirmation that God is sovereign, that God is on his throne. and that God's going to do what God says he's going to do. So he's telling Abram, he's really forcing the issue that Abram's going to have to trust in the character of God. That's verse 1. The plan of God, verse 2 to 6. We've looked at each of those. Verse 7 to verse 21 is the power of God. That's where we're at. And we're really in the passage, we're in a sense, the second half of verse 14, working our way down. So, as you know, if you've been following the series, been following the sessions that we've been having, Abram brings together these animals that God tells him to go and get. And Abram presents them to God, kills them, cuts them open, lays the halves out, because this is going to be a treaty, a covenant that God's going to make. Abram knows what's coming. He doesn't know how it's all going to play out. He doesn't know how all this is going to work, but he knows what's about to happen, generally speaking. So he gets it all prepared, gets it all ready, and doesn't allow the vultures to come down and eat the carcasses, because he's all in on this. It's important to him. And so Abram has everything ready for the treaty. He knows that if God makes this treaty, this is God binding himself to accomplish what God says he will accomplish on pain of death. And God's eternal, and God's sovereign, and God's going to do this. So in a sense, he's accommodating Abram by doing by cutting the covenant, or making the covenant in this fashion, through this ancient Near Eastern tradition, to provide comfort and confirmation to Abram's heart and soul that God is going to accomplish his plan that he has for Abram. But as I mentioned last time, something happens that Abram doesn't expect. You would think that, okay, we go from verse 11, and the next verse 12, should be what is in verse 17. But something else takes place prior to that. In verse 12, it says that the sun's going down, and Abram falls into a deep sleep. God brings him into a deep sleep, like he did Adam back in Genesis 2. And there's a terrifying darkness that comes down over him, like a foreboding. And I described that as God making sure that Abram is going to feel what he's about to be told. That what he's about to be told he's going to feel it as well. At an emotional level, spiritual level, mental level, at every level of his being. And what's God going to do here? What God's going to do, verse 13, the Lord speaks to Abram. The Lord speaks to him. The Lord is going to, in verse 13 to verse 16, reveal truth to him. Reveal important information to him. That's what's going to happen. That's what's going to take place. And we've looked at parts of this already, where God says, you can be sure what I'm going to tell you is true. It's going to happen. You can be sure that your descendants, those descendants that are as many as the stars, as many as the sand on the seashore, your descendants are going to be strangers in a foreign land. Notice, and I said this, I think last time, where he doesn't give him the name of the foreign country or the foreign land. In verse 14, he calls them just the nation. He doesn't tell them it's going to be Egypt. Maybe that would bring up too many bad memories because of when Abram went down into Egypt. He doesn't want him to know that. Now, we know that because we have the Bible, we have the history, we have it all. And even Moses, who's writing this under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, giving this to the nation of Israel before they go into the promised land, boy, do they know who the foreign land is. Yeah, they know it very well. So God is revealing prophecy. This is a prophetic utterance. This is a God revealing not just truth, but prophetic truth. Truth that has not yet happened, but that will surely happen, right? You can be sure. He says in verse 13. So, your descendants are going to be strangers in a foreign land. And as we know, they're going to be welcomed, aren't they? As we will see from Genesis 37 to Genesis chapter 50, they're going to be welcomed into the land. Remember how at the end of Genesis, I just thought of this, and I got to look it up. Yeah, here we go. Genesis chapter 50. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin. Well, when Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. This is what they said. Look, we are your slaves, they said. Interesting. They used that terminology. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. They were welcomed by the Pharaoh of that day. They were welcomed into the land. But as God said to Abram, it wouldn't last. Now, when he's telling them that there'll be strangers in a foreign land, he doesn't give them all the details. He doesn't give them Genesis 37, chapter 37, verse 50. He doesn't tell them the whole story in every little detail. These are broad strokes. It's a pattern that God has when he's giving prophetic statements where you don't get the full picture, but you get glimpses, enough to know what God's intention is. But it's not going to last, at least that warm welcome. By the time you get to the pages of Exodus, they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. Time is going to pass. Time is going to go on. And they're going to be oppressed as slaves for a long period of time. We looked at that and we saw that this is them in bondage. This is the setting of the opening of the book of Exodus. There was the new king who did not know Joseph. That's listed in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. And based on the Egyptian records and piecing the timelines together, it was a man named Sobek Hotep III. And he is the one that enslaved the nation of Israel, the people, and oppressed them. There would come another Neferhotep who would become the adoptive grandfather of Moses. As time went on and generation after generation went on, there would be Neferhotep, who would arise and become the Pharaoh, and he would be the adoptive grandfather of Moses. But then as Moses grew up, there was another Pharaoh, Khanefer Sebek-hotep IV, who would be the Pharaoh when Moses left the land to go to Midian. So they're going to be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. Within all of that story, you have the story of Moses and everything that takes place, which we'll get to when we look at Exodus. But notice what God says: I will punish the nation that enslaves them. And last time I told you that God punishing is God's retribution against that nation for its mistreatment of Abram's descendants. And I told you how encompassing that is. It's the plagues that's going to come down upon the land of Egypt, upon the people of Egypt. It's the Passover. We will see that and how the firstborn dies. It's when they leave and Egypt chases after them, and God brings the people of Egypt through the sea on dry ground, and the water closes and capulates upon the Egyptian army. That is God punishing the nation, but there's something else that takes place after that. Yahweh, God, is going to judge the oppressors. Stephen, in his sermon in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 7, let me turn there. This is a very familiar sermon if you've read through the book of Acts. But notice what it says here. Here's Stephen quoting. He says, God gave him, Abram, no inheritance here, not even 1 square foot of land. God did promise, however, that eventually the whole land would belong to Abraham and his descendants, even though he had no children yet, or at that point. God also told him that his descendants would live in a foreign land where they would be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. And then he says, but I will punish the nation that enslaves them, God said. And in the end, they will come out and worship me here in this place. And so Stephen is quoting the same text that is written down in Genesis 15. Quoting again that nation of Egypt would be punished. Now, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the Pharaoh that lived when Moses came back and all the plagues were happening, was a guy named Dudimos II. Dudimos II. And there is a historian, a Jewish historian, Josephus, quoting another ancient Egyptian historian named Manetho, who makes this statement. So Manetho made this statement. His works haven't been found, but Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, quotes Manetho as stating the following. Tutimoeus, which is another way of the name for Dudimos II. This is the same individual. So here's an Egyptian historian being quoted by a Jewish historian about the Pharaoh who lived during the time of the Exodus, of when the people went out. It says, in his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us. Not gods, God. And unexpectedly, from the regions of the east, invaders of an obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily seized it without striking a blow. And having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, their gods, treated all the natives, the people who were living in the land, with cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. And finally, they appointed as king one of their number, whose name was Salitis. And in the Sait name, he found a city very favorably situated on the east of the Bubasiti branch of the Nile River, and called Avaris after an ancient religious tradition. Avaris was the city that the people of Israel had to build when they were in captivity and oppressed as slaves. We'll talk about that when we get to Exodus and how all that works in terms of the naming. This place he rebuilt and fortified with massive walls, planting there a garrison of as many as 240,000 heavy armed men to guard his frontier. Their race as a whole was called Hyksos, that is, king shepherds. The Hyksos, Hyksos, was a kingdom that came in, and guess what they did? You see, the army of Egypt under the Pharaoh during the Exodus, they were massacred and killed by God in the water, chasing after the people of Israel, chasing after the nation of Israel. Because of the pride of the Pharaoh, thinking that he could beat the nation of Israel and beat the God of the people of Israel, he went after them. And God wiped out that army. Remember, Moses says, "You will never see these people again." And so the land of Egypt had no army, had no one to protect it. And God brought in another kingdom, another group of people. They call themselves the Hyksos, Hyksos, king shepherds. And what did they do? They took over the land of Egypt. They massacred people, took others as slaves, and they occupied the land. And they became Egypt for the period of time that they ruled. They were Egypt. See what God's doing? When he says he's punishing that nation, boy, does he punish them. Because they enslaved God's people, because they enslaved God's people through the descendants and the lineage of Abraham or Abraham. See what God tells Abram here in prophetic language took place. This shows Abram the power of God. And what happened afterwards? And in the end, they will come away with great wealth. They are going to have a massive, massive wealth. Remember in the story? They come away with gold. They come away with everything. They have it all. I don't remember the exact passage, but as you know, they come away with great wealth as they walked out of the nation of Egypt. I'm looking to see if I can find that passage. I'll have to look it up and have it for next time. God is going to give them great wealth, belongings, possessions. Did God do that to Abram when Abram came out of Egypt? Yeah. So in one sense, even though Abram doesn't know all the details, he doesn't know the name of the country, he doesn't know that it's going to be Egypt, he doesn't realize that it's going to be the same nation that he went down into. God is going to have something happen again that's a pattern. And guess what? To give you a picture of this, remember in the book of Matthew? Matthew chapter 2. The Magi, the wise men, they come and they worship Jesus, the child. And they opened their treasures chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And where do they go? They go into Egypt. And then they come out of Egypt. In the passage that's in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, it's fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet Hosea. I called my son out of Egypt. There's a lot of parallels. Abram goes to Egypt, comes back. The nation of Israel goes into Egypt, comes back. Christ goes into Egypt, comes back. They're not all the same, but there's a pattern. This is God showing Abram his power. Notice quickly verse 16. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land. We'll look at verse 15 next time. I want to look at verse 16 because that continues the train of thought. Verse 15 is personal towards Abram. But after 4 generations, the idea of generations, it's the Hebrew word dor, D-O-R, is the transliterated English of that. It's used in a limited sense of a biological generation or as in a general sense of a span of time. So some interpreters assume that in the patriarchal age, a generation could be taken to be the equivalent of about 100 years. So 4 generations, 400 years. The average duration of life was still above 150 years. And Isaac was born in the 100th. Interesting, Isaac's born in the 100th year of Abram's life, which Abram here is about in his early 80s. So Isaac is still not going to be born for maybe a good 17, 18, 19 years from now, or from the time this event takes place. But he says, after 4 generations, after that period of time, when God decrees that the time is up, again, we have the history of all of that. He says, your descendants will return here to this land. And so, again, he's giving them the broad strokes of it. But if you know the story, it's not that generation that comes back to the land, is it? It's only Caleb and Joseph, or Caleb and Joshua, who come back with the new generation that was raised up after the generation who acted wickedly. Again, that's more details of the story. God is not telling him every little detail, but telling him what he needs to know to have the comfort, to have the peace, to have the assurance that God is going to do what he says he will do. He says, after 4 generations, your descendants, even though it's a different generation, will return here to this land. They're going to come to the physical land that I have promised them. They're going to come. It's this new nation of people that will eventually gain possession of the land of Canaan, where the Canaanites live. Remember Noah's prophecy in Genesis 9? This prophecy essentially establishes the nation of Israel. It is important to note that this national identity is here given in the context of the covenant that is going to be made here, starting in verse 17, going down through verse 21. The Abrahamic covenant that's going to be established by God with Abram in this chapter is the foundation of the existence of the Hebrew people, the nation of Israel, that God is going to raise up from the loins of Abraham. And why will it take that period of time? Why is this not happening tomorrow? Why is Abram having to realize that this is going to take a long time? It's because God says this, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. What does that mean? We're going to look at that next time. That is a very interesting statement. And we need to dwell on that one for a little while. Let's pray. Dear God, we do again give you thanks for all that you provide for us, all that you give us. Lord, you're giving Abram prophetic truth. And Lord, this is prophecy that we know the full details of. But Lord, it gives us the pattern of how you reveal yourself. There's so much that's going to happen in the future. We don't know the full script of all of that, but you do. And you are in charge. Shows us your power. It shows us that you have power. You have ultimate power, omnipotent power. And you choose to love us and take care of us. What a blessing that is. Lord, may you receive all the praise and all the glory forever and ever and ever. Amen. So we are working our way through this chapter, line upon line, phrase upon phrase, verse by verse. And that statement, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction, is something that you need to be aware of. You need to know what that means, its implications, and so on. And that's what we'll look at next time. We're going to focus just the next lesson on all of that. Okay? And and then we'll continue with verse 17 through verse 21. So tell those about the series, tell those about the channel, the YouTube channel, the series in Genesis, and may the Lord continue to bless you, and we'll see you next time.